Hello and welcome to the Bartholomew School GCSE English Literature revision video focusing on how to answer the power and conflict poetry question for English Literature Paper 2. Before we start properly, you need to make sure that you have in front of you your GCSE English Literature revision booklet, a highlighter, a pen, some lined paper and your poetry anthology. So before we go any further, you might want to pause the video to make sure that you have assembled those things. We're going to be focusing on practice question 1 from the power and conflict practice questions in your booklet. That's the one about bayonet charge and violence. You therefore need to make sure that you can see a copy of bayonet charge. In the exam, you won't have your anthology with you, but you will have a clean copy of the name poem. So if you want to do this properly, you could print a clean copy of bayonet charge from the internet, which you will find if you type it into Google. Otherwise, for the purposes of this activity, you could use your copy in your anthology. Either way, pause the video now to find the copy that you're going to use. In an exam situation, the first thing that you need to do is look closely at the question. So let's do that now with a highlighter. The first thing to notice is the command word, which is compare. This tells us that we need to have a second poem and that every paragraph we write, including introductions and conclusions, needs to have a discussion of both poems. Next, notice the theme word, which in this case is violence. The question does not ask us to write everything we know about bayonet charge and another poem. It asks us to explore violence in bayonet charge and another poem. Therefore, we need to think about our second poem in relation to that theme of violence. With this in mind, let's take our opportunity to select our second poem. Here's the list of the ones that we've studied. We can rule out fairly immediately the poems that don't really have any violence in them, and of course blank out bayonet charge itself. It might be possible to make an argument that a poem like, say, Kamikaze is about emotional violence, and you might well be able to pull this off, but it would be very tempting to write about things other than violence too, and for that reason we're going to make a more obvious selection for this video. You might also notice that the poems that we have left are all war poems. It can be a good revision strategy to categorise your poems into war, power and other conflict groups so that you find making this selection a bit easier with a bit of practice. Of course you could have selected any of these poems, but for the sake of this video we're going to compare how the poets present violence in bayonet charge and exposure. So back to highlighting the question. We're next going to notice that the question uses the word how and the word present. This tells us that we need to focus our answer on the techniques and methods that the poets are using. This should include ideas about language, structure and form. Lastly, we should notice the use of the word poets. This tells us that we need to be writing about the poems as literature, using the poets' names in our answer, and not assuming that the soldiers the poems depict are real people. We shouldn't take the poems too literally. So let's turn now to the named poem. I'll read it, and as I do so, follow with your highlighter. Pick out words, phrases, techniques and structural devices that you think you could say something interesting about, and remember that the question focus is violence. Suddenly he awoke and was running, raw, in raw seemed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire, hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air. He lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. In bewilderment then he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? He was running, like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. Then the shot slashed furrows, threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide open, silent, its eyes standing out. He plunged past with his bayonet toward the green hedge. King, honour, human dignity, etc. dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm to get out of that blue crackling air, his terror's touchy dynamite. So what could we have picked out to analyse? Well, I might pull out the phrase bullets smacking the belly out of the air, because it's an effective metaphor, and there's also lots of opportunity to analyse the lexical choices in relation to the theme of violence. I might also have picked out that final line, "his terror's touchy dynamite." I'll be able to analyse this with multiple levels of interpretation. So for instance, you could argue that the soldier himself has become a weapon, an instrument of violence, but you could also argue that this line speaks of his self-destruction, a kind of internal violence. It's at the end, so we can consider the structural importance, and obviously we can talk about the alliteration too. Looking across the whole text, I might have picked out the dynamic verbs that speak of violence and panic. And then lastly, I might have picked out the structural features that speak of violence, like the frequent use of the dashes, which might reflect the soldier's breathlessness, or even the shot-slashed environment in which he is running, and the enjambment, for instance, in the final 4 lines, that suggests continuous, inescapable panic as a result of the violence of the environment. So you might have highlighted other things, and that is completely fine, as long as you can write interestingly about those quotations in the light of the idea of violence. But you'll remember that this question doesn't just ask you about bayonet charge, it also asks you to compare it to a second poem, and we've chosen Exposure. So you should by this point have some quotations from Exposure that you're committing to memory. Let's try and mind map some of the moments that might be good to speak about in relation to the question of violence. You might recall that first line, which describes the merciless iced east winds that knife us. The violence in this poem, you could argue, is as much about the brutality of nature and the conditions in the trenches as it is about the war itself. If you can recall it, you could link it to a second moment where nature is personified as a violent enemy. One of the effects of violence in Exposure is that the speaker has suffered so much trauma that he now, when he sees innocent movements like the movement of a fence in the wind, he associates them with the horrors that he has seen. The simile, describing the barbed wire being tugged by gusts of wind, is a good example of how violence in Exposure has penetrated the soldier's mind too. "Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence" is a good quotation because it's a great example of sibilance, mimicking the sound of the flying bullets and suggesting that violence is inescapable. When we were thinking about bayonet charge, we made some structural points. In Exposure, we could talk about the repeated use of rhetorical questions to suggest that violence causes a loss of certainty and maybe even a loss of identity. We might add to that by also looking at the repeated use of ellipsis, which creates a sense of threat, as though violence lingers over the place and could strike at any moment. So we've now come up with a good set of ideas that we can explore from both poems. I'd suggest that a good way of planning your ideas is to put them down in a table a bit like this. We want to plan 3 or 4 really good analytical comparative paragraphs using the ideas we've taken from both poems. So let's start by writing down the quotations from Bayonet Charge in a sensible kind of order. We'll start with a quotation from near the beginning of the poem. Then we'll consider the lexical pattern of verbs that runs throughout. Next we'll write about structure. And finally we'll consider the final line of the poem. So now we need to think about the comparison. The first quotation from Bayonet Charge is about the bullets and the violence damage done by weapons. I'll use this as a point of similarity and compare it with the quotation from Exposure, "Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence," which will allow me to make the comparative point that in both poems the violence of weaponry permeates the text. The pattern of verbs in Bayonet Charge runs throughout the poem. It could compare nicely to the pattern of personification of the weather in Exposure. So I'll choose my 2 quotations about that from the second poem, and I'll make the comparative point, whereas Bayonet Charge uses verbs to show the effect of violence in the middle of battle, Exposure uses personification to show that even conditions in the trenches between battles are violent. It makes sense to compare structure with structure, and I'll suggest in my essay that both poems use structure to reflect the fear caused by violence. And then finally, I'll compare the metaphors used, and I'll make a more sophisticated point about the effect of violence on the mental and emotional states of the soldiers. I also need to link to context in my answer, so my last bit of planning is going to be to make some notes about the kind of context I could write about. For the exploration of weapons and bullets, I'll explore the preparation of soldiers in World War I. To develop my point about the weather in exposure, I might dwell on the conditions in the trenches. When I write about the fear reflected in the poem's structures, I'll link to the context of life in the trenches too. And then finally, to develop my point about the effects of violence, I'll consider post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and shell shock. So there's some interesting biographical context for Owen that I could add here too. So now we have the backbone of 4 paragraphs. You might not necessarily write them in this order, and if you're aiming for a level 6 or above, you would definitely want to have a sense of argument, with a brief introduction and conclusion, which might cause you to reorder some of these points. So let's have a look at what one paragraph might look like written up into an essay. In both Bayonet Charge and Exposure, the violence of the enemy's weapons permeates the poems. Hughes describes bullets smacking the belly out of the air, whereas Owen writes that sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. In both, the reader is invited to reflect on the power of the bullets. In Bayonet Charge, the power of this violence is created through the personification of the air. The idea that the air itself is being damaged by war indicates that these bullets are ubiquitous and their destructive violence is far-reaching. The use of the verb smacking creates an impression of the force with which the bullets make impact, emphasised through that use of onomatopoeia. Furthermore, the noun belly has connotations of childishness and innocence, suggesting that the air, perhaps nature itself, is being victimised. The belly is also at the centre of the body, perhaps implying that the bullets are damaging nature at its very core. In Exposure, however, the bullets are less actively violent and more threatening. The use of the sibilants imitates the sound the bullets make in the silent night, and the constant repetition of this sound throughout the line gives the reader the impression of just how many bullets are flying. The adjective sudden has connotations of surprise and fear, and the verb streak indicates the power of the bullets. Both poems draw on the idea that during World War I, soldiers were often inadequately prepared for the type of battles they faced. In Bayonet Charge, Hughes encourages us to reflect on the disparity between the bullets and the soldier's bayonet, a poor defence. Whereas in Exposure, Owen indicates that even between battles in the trenches, soldiers were still in danger. Helmets, for instance, were not introduced until late into the war. Many soldiers would die from head wounds caused by bullets hitting in the trenches themselves. In both poems, the pervasive force of enemy bullets suggests that violence is inescapable and terrifying. So you can see in this paragraph that I have given a response to the question, which was about violence, in my first sentence. I've made comparison in relation to violence at the start, in the middle, and at the end of the paragraph. I've offered a quotation from both poems. I've analysed my quotation from Bayonet Charge in detail using technical vocabulary. I've done the same for my quotation from Exposure. Towards the end of my paragraph, I've explored context. This answer should take you about 45 minutes to write. You can look back at any part of this video to help you with the planning, and use your revision booklet to remind you of what you are being marked on. Have a go at writing your response and hand it to your teacher for some feedback, and then you can try any of the other questions in the booklet using exactly the same method. Thank you for watching, and good luck with your response.